The station called Ethara Prime floated in the black emptiness between stars like a diamond. Someone had forgotten to pick up, and every species in the known galaxy had sent their best liars and politicians to sit inside it and pretend they wanted. Peace Commander Elias Voss stood at the back of the human delegation and tried very hard not to feel like a child who had wandered into a room full of giants, because that is exactly what he was to them. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 11 years, and in those 11 years, every single alien species had made it very clear that humans were loud and messy and emotional and too young to sit at the table where real decisions were, made his commanding officer Admiral Chun had pulled him aside before they boarded the station and told him one thing: watch and learn and do not embarrass us. So Elias watched. He watched the Dralith delegation march in like an army, pretending to be diplomats, their scales dark as burnt iron and their eyes the color of old blood, and he watched every other species in the room step back just a little when they entered, because the Dralith did not negotiate, and everyone knew it, and everyone pretended they did not know. I watched the Corellan trade lords float in on their gravity chairs, too important to walk on their own legs, and he watched the insectoid Vethany click and hiss in a language that sounded like breaking glass, and then the lights in the great hall dimmed just slightly and the temperature dropped by 2 degrees, and every single being in the room went quiet. The Velnorai had arrived. Elias had read about them in the briefing files, but reading about the Velnorai was like reading about the ocean and then seeing it for the first time, because nothing in those files had prepared him for what walked through that door. Were tall and impossibly graceful, and their skin shifted in color like light moving through deep water, and they did not speak because they had never spoken, because in 10,000 years of recorded history, no Velnorai had ever made a sound with their mouth. They were telepaths, and not the weak kind that could read surface thoughts, but the deep kind that shared consciousness, the way humans shared air, and they communicated through feeling and resonance, and their translators, called the resonance, walked beside them, turning their silent emotions into words for the lesser species. At the center of the delegation walked a figure that made Elias forget how to breathe. She was younger than the others, and her skin glowed with a pale silver light that shifted to soft blue at the edges, and her eyes were large and dark and filled with something that looked like every star Elias had ever seen, and she moved like music would move if music had a body. Princess Seylith Qo'Vaan, third heir to the Velnorai ascendancy. The briefing file had called her a political figurehead and said she had no real power, and Elias had believed that right up until the moment he saw every species in the room bow their heads when she passed. She did not look at any of them. Her resonance formed a circle around her, translating the greetings of other delegations into feelings she could absorb, and she absorbed them the way a stone absorbs rain, without any sign that it mattered. Elias watched her, and he saw something that no one else seemed to see. She was not bored, and she was not above them, and she was not cold. She was lonely. He recognized it because he had worn that exact same expression every day since humanity had joined the galactic stage and been told to sit in the corner and be grateful they were allowed in it. All the first day of the summit was a disaster, and the second day was worse, and by the third day, the Dralith were openly threatening to annex 3 star systems, and the Corellan were threatening sanctions, and the Vethani were threatening to eat someone, which might have been a translation error, but no one was sure. Humanity was told to observe and contribute nothing on the third night. Elias could not sleep, so he walked to the observation deck at the top of the station, where the walls were transparent and the stars pressed in from every direction like they wanted to get closer. She was already there. Seylith stood alone at the edge of the deck with her hands pressed against the glass, and her skin glowing a deep indigo that Elias would later learn meant sadness, and she was so still she could have been a statue carved from moonlight. Her resonance were gone, and her guards were gone, and she was just a girl standing in the dark, looking at the stars, and for a moment, Elias almost turned around and left because he knew he was not supposed to be near her, and he knew every rule he would be breaking, but she looked so alone. He walked forward and sat on the floor near the glass about 10 feet from where she stood, and he did not look at her, and he did not try to talk to her, and he just sat there. And because the silence felt heavy, and because he did not know what else to do, he started talking. He told her about Earth. He told her about the Pacific Ocean, and how it was so big you could fly over it for hours and still see nothing but blue. And he told her about rain, and how it sounded on a tin roof like 1,000 tiny drummers playing a song they made up as they went. And he told her about the smell of grass after a storm, and the way the sun looked when it set over the mountains near his hometown in Colorado. She did not respond, and she did not move, and she did not look at him, but she did not leave. And after a while her skin changed color from deep indigo to something warmer, something softer, something like amber mixed with gold. And Elias did not know what that color meant, but it felt like the first warm day after a long winter. He talked until his voice went rough, and then he stopped, and they sat in silence together. And for the first time since he had arrived at this station full of aliens who thought he was nothing, Elias did not feel small. When he finally stood to leave, she turned her head and looked at him, just looked, and in her dark, endless eyes, he saw something that hit him like a punch to the chest. She had understood every single word. He walked away with his heart hammering and his hand shaking, and he did not see the figure standing in the corridor, shadows watching him with cold, ancient eyes. The chief resident Valen had been searching for the princess for an hour, and he had found her, and he had seen her skin glow amber in 300 years of service to the royal house. Valen had never seen that color on any Velnorai. He did not know what it meant, but he knew it had been caused by the human, and that terrified him more than anything the Dralith could ever do. It became a ritual without either of them deciding it would be one. Every night after the summit sessions ended and the diplomats retreated to their quarters to scheme and lie in private, Elias would walk to the observation deck, and she would already be there. He talked, and she listened, and the stars watched them both. Told her about snowfall, and how the world went so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. And he told her about dogs and how they loved you so much it was almost stupid. And he told her about music, and this was the part where she leaned closer. He described a piano to her, and he could see she did not understand, so he hummed a few notes of something his mother used to play, and her skin rippled with colors he had never seen before, like someone had dropped light into water on the fourth night. She did something that changed everything. She reached out and placed her hand near his, not touching, but close enough that he could feel warmth radiating from her skin, and then he felt it. It was not a sound, and it was not a word, and it was not anything he could name, but it poured into him like warm water filling an empty glass, and it was gratitude and wonder and a loneliness so deep it made his eyes sting. She was sharing her feelings with him, not the way she shared with her people, where everything was open and communal and owned by everyone, but something smaller and more deliberate, like handing someone a gift wrapped in trust. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that moment, they understood each other better than any translator could have managed. The next day, Elias started paying closer attention to the Velnorai, and what he saw made his stomach turn. They moved as one, and they thought as one, and they felt as one, and at first it sounded beautiful, the way a hive of bees sounds beautiful, until you realize that no single bee ever gets to decide where it flies. The Velnorai shared everything, and that meant no Velnorai ever had a thought that was truly private, and no Velnorai ever felt something that was truly their own. And the word for that was not harmony. The word for that was prison. And then he understood why Seylith came to the observation deck every night. Humans were Psi-null, which meant their minds were invisible to telepathy, which meant that when Seylith stood near Elias, her people could not feel what she was feeling. For the first time in her entire life, her emotions belonged only to her. he was not just company. He was freedom. This realization hit Elias like a freight train, and he sat with it for a long time, staring at the stars and thinking about what it must be like to never once in your life have a secret and never once feel something without every mind around you feeling it too. And he decided that was the loneliest thing he had ever heard. On the 6th day, Valen found him in the corridor. Chief Resonant was ancient, even by Velnorai standards, and his skin was a permanent shade of cold gray. And his eyes held the kind of authority that came from centuries of being obeyed without question. You will stay away from the Princess, Elias. Looked at him and did not step back. She comes to me, and I am not going to tell her to stop. She is sacred, said Valan, and the word carried weight like a mountain, and her emotional purity must not be contaminated by a primitive species. Elias felt anger rise in his chest, but he held it steady, and he said something that made Valen flinch. She is a person, not a relic, and if you cannot see the difference, then you have been guarding her so long, you forgot she is Alavevalon. Stared at him for a long time, and then walked away without another word, and Elias stood in the corridor with his heart pounding, and his fist clenched, and wondered if he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The summit continued to fall apart, and the Dralith grew bolder every day, and behind closed doors, species were forming alliances not for peace, but for war. And humanity was being pulled in every direction, because both sides wanted human soldiers, since humans were expendable and bred fast and fought like cornered animals. On the 7th night, Seylith sent him a gift through a resonant. It was a memory crystal, and when Elias held it to his ear, he heard the solar winds of her home world, a sound like a choir singing in a language older than time, and it was so beautiful. It made his chest ache. He did not know that among the Velnorai, giving someone the sound of your home was the most intimate gesture possible, and it was something that was only done between bonded pairs. He did not know this, but everyone in the Velnorai delegation did, and the scandal spread through their telepathic network. Like fire through dry grass, Elias wanted to give her something back, and he thought for a long time about what a human could offer to a princess who had never spoken a word, and he decided on the only thing that made sense. He gave her musica recording of a simple piano piece, and when she pressed it to her ear and the first notes played, her skin erupted in colors that had no name, and her resonance stepped back in shock because they could feel her joy through the network, and it was so strong and so raw and so completely hers that it overwhelmed them. She played it again and again until the crystal was warm in her hands. That night she did not come to the observation deck, and Elias worried, but he did not know what she was doing. She was in her quarters alone with the doors sealed, accessing human linguistic archives on the station network, and studying something no Velnorai had studied in 10,000 years. The structure of spoken language, not telepathic communication, and not empathic projection, but actual physical sound shaped by breath and throat and tongue and lips and intention. The idea was heretical and dangerous, and if her people knew, they would be horrified. She did not care. She had heard music for the first time, and it had broken something open inside her, and now she wanted to know what it would feel like to make a sound of her owning. The deepest hours of the night cycle, she stood alone in her quarters and opened her mouth and tried to push air through vocal cords that had not been used in her species for millennia. Nothing came out. She tried again and again, and nothing and nothing and nothing, and then on the 15th try something happened. A sound came out of her throat, so small and so broken it was barely more than a whisper, like a candle flame in a hurricane, but it was there, and it was hers. And 5,000 light years away on the Velnorai homeworld, the High Council felt a disturbance in the collective consciousness, like a crack spreading through glass, and they did not know what it was, but they knew it was dangerous. They dispatched their most powerful enforcer, the one they called the Silencing Hand. The Dralith made their move on the 9th day. They seized a contested relay station at the edge of the Orion corridor and blockaded 3 trade routes that half the galaxy depended on. And they did it with a smile and a formal declaration that called it defensive repositioning, and everyone knew it was a stranglehold, but knowing and doing something about it were two very different things. The summit exploded species that had been pretending to be civil dropped their masks, and the great hall filled with shouting and threats and the sound of translator devices working overtime to convert rage into 100 different languages. The Corellan threatened economic ruin, and the Vethany threatened something that definitely was not a translation error this time, and the smaller species huddled together like prey animals watching wolves circle humanity was pulled into emergency meetings, and Admiral Chun paced the room like a caged tiger, and the message from Earth was clear: stay neutral and do not pick a side. Elias stood up and said something that made every officer in the room stare at him. Velnorai can stop this, and they are the only species every faction respects, and if they broker the peace, everyone will accept. Itchin looked at him with tired eyes and said the Velnorai do not broker anything because the Velnorai do not speak. Elias wanted to say something, but he could not say what he knew because what he knew was impossible and no one would believe him. Anyway, that night he went to the observation deck and she was not there, and he felt the absence like a missing tooth, and he waited for an hour before returning to his quarters. She was standing outside his door, alone, and without guards and without resonance, and the light in the corridor made her skin glow like the surface of a pearl, and she looked at him with those dark, endless eyes, and he could see fear in them. Real, honest fear. He opened the door, and she walked in and stood in the center of his small room, and she was trembling. She opened her mouth. Sound that came out was not a word, and it was barely a sound at all, but it was there. And it was rough and broken like something dragged over gravel, and it clearly hurt her because she winced and pressed her hand to her throat. But she tried again and again. On the fourth try, something came out that almost sounded like a syllable. Elias understood what this was costing her, and he understood it in a way that went deeper than language, because he had seen soldiers push through pain, and he had seen people fight for things that mattered, but he had never seen anything like this. A woman from a species that had not spoken in 10,000 years, standing in his quarters at midnight, trying to break through millennia of silence because she wanted to say something. He sat down on the floor and gestured for her to sit, and she did, and he started with the simplest thing he could think of. He made a sound and pointed to his lips. She watched and tried to copy it, and what came out was wrong, but it was closer than before, and he smiled and nodded. They sat on the floor of his quarters for 3 hours, and he taught her the way you teach someone who has never used their legs to walk, and there was no rush and no pressure. And when she got frustrated and her skin turned the dark red of anger, he would just wait and then try again. By the time she left, she could make 4 distinct sounds, and her throat was raw, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears if Velnorai could cry. She touched his hand before she left, and he felt it again, that warm flood of emotion, and this time it was not just gratitude. It was something bigger and fiercer, and made his heart hammer so hard he thought his ribs might crack. The next morning the silencing hand arrived. His name was Koth, and he was the tallest Velnorai Elias had ever seen, and his skin was the color of a dying star, a deep, angry red that pulsed with power, and he walked through the station like gravity itself bent around him. The silencing hand was not a title given lightly, and Koth had earned it by realigning more wayward Velnorai than anyone in the history of the Ascendancy, and realignment was a gentle word for what he did. He reached into your mind and smoothed out the wrinkles and erased the parts that did not fit the collective, and when he was done, you were still alive, but the person you had been was gone, and in their place was a perfect, harmonious member of the network, and the Velnorai did not consider this cruel. They considered it mercy. Koth met with Seylith in the Velnorai quarters, and what he found shook him to his core. Her psionic signature had gaps, dark spots where her thoughts were invisible to him like holes in a net, and he had never encountered anything like this in 600 years of service, and he knew immediately what had caused it. Human time spent near a psi-null mind had changed her neural pathways and created spaces inside her consciousness where the collective could not reach, and those spaces were growing. He told her plainly that she must return home and that the realignment would be painless and that she would be restored to harmony, and she would forget the confusion and the loneliness and the sound she had been trying to make. She looked at him and did not move. He told her again she did not move, and for the first time in his long life, Qo'Vaan saw something in a Velnorai that he had only ever seen in lesser species. Defiance, he gave her 1 day to reconsider, and he warned her that if she did not come willingly, he would do what he had been sent to do. Elias heard about the confrontation from a resonant who had been sympathetic to the princess and who found the human in the corridor and told him everything in rapid whispered translation. Elias walked straight to the Velnorai quarters, and he found Qo'Vaan standing in the hallway like a wall made of starlight and fury. Elias was shorter and weaker, and his mind was invisible, and he had no weapons and no authority and no power that any species in the galaxy would recognize. He stood in front of Qo'Vaan anyway. You are not taking her. Qo'Vaan looked down at him the way a mountain looks down at a pebble. You are nothing, little human, and you cannot even be felt, and you stand before me as if you could stop what I cannot stop you, said Elias, and his voice was steady even though his hands were shaking. But I can stand here, and you will have to go through me, and she will see you do it, and she will know that the bond Velnorai way of harmony requires crushing the people who stand in the way. Qo'Vaan stared at him for a long time, and something moved behind those ancient eyes, something that looked almost like doubt, and then the station shook. The lights went red and alarms screamed through every corridor, and the floor buckled under their feet, and somewhere in the distance, something exploded with a sound like a giant cracking its knuckles. The Dralith had launched an attack on the station itself, not an invasion but a surgical strike designed to look like it came from the Vithani, and it was perfect and it was devastating, and within minutes the summit was not just failing, it was burning, and in the chaos and the fire and the screaming, Elias looked at Qo'Vaan, and Qo'Vaan looked at Elias, and for one single moment the most powerful enforcer in the Velnorai ascendancy, and one completely ordinary human understood each other perfectly. Something was coming that was bigger than both of them, and it had already begun. The explosion had torn through the eastern wing of Ethera Prime and ripped open 3 decks, and the station was bleeding atmosphere into the void, and the screaming had not stopped since it began. Elias ran. He ran through corridors filled with smoke and sparks and terrified delegates from species he could not name, and he did not think about rank or protocol or the fact that humanity had been told to sit in the corner and observe. He grabbed a Corellan trade lord whose gravity chair had failed and dragged the massive slug-like creature to safety with his bare hands, and the Corellan was so shocked that a human was touching him that he forgot to be offended. Organized evacuation teams from whoever was nearby, and it did not matter if they were human or alien, because burning alive does not care about your species, and he barked orders and pointed directions and sealed breached doors with manual overrides and pulled people from wreckage with bleeding fingers. 3 other human officers found him and fell in beside him without a word, because humans were like that, and when the world caught fire, they did not freeze, and they did not retreat into committee meetings. They moved. A section of ceiling collapsed, and Elias threw himself over a small figure and took the impact on his back, and when the dust cleared, he looked down and saw what he had shielded. Dralith child. She was young, and her scales were soft and pale, and she was crying in a language he did not understand. And her people were the ones who had caused this, and her people were the enemy. Elias picked her up and carried her to the medical station and handed her to the Dralith medics, and one of them looked at him with something in his reptilian eyes that might have been confusion or might have been shame. In the Velnorai quarters, the delegation had sealed themselves in, and they were doing what Velnorai always did in a crisis. They were thinking together. The entire delegation had linked into a telepathic consensus, and they were sharing information and analyzing options and debating responses, and it should have been efficient, and it should have been powerful, but it was neither, because they were also sharing fear, and fear in a telepathic network does not add up the way numbers add up, and instead it multiplies, and it echoes, and it feeds on itself, until every mind in the network is drowning in the combined terror of every other mind, and the Velnorai were paralyzed. Valen tried to guide them toward a decision, and failed. The resonance tried to filter the noise, and failed. The mighty Velnorai, with their 10,000 years of telepathic mastery, were locked in a feedback loop of sheer panic, and they could not move, and they could not act, and they could not even think. Seylith stood in the middle of this storm, and she felt all of it pouring through her mind, and she tried to push through the fear and find clarity, but the network was too strong and too loud and too much. Then she looked at the door, and she thought about the observation deck and the quiet, and the man who sat beside her and talked about rain. She thought about the spaces in her mind that the collective could not reach, the dark spots, the private places. She pulled herself into those spaces and closed the network out, and for the first time in her life, she stood inside her own mind completely alone, and the silence was terrifying and beautiful. She walked to the door and opened it. Velen called after her through the network, and she did not respond. Koth moved to block her path, and she looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made the most powerful enforcer in the ascendancy step aside. She walked through the burning corridors of the station, and the smoke did not touch her, and the sparks did not burn her, and she moved like something inevitable, like water flowing downhill, like a star falling toward the place it was always meant to land. She reached the great hall. It was chaos. Delegates from every species were screaming at each other, and the Dralith were denying involvement, and the Vethani were being blamed, and weapons were being drawn, not officially, but hands were on holsters, and the room was a powder keg with 100 lit matches. Seylith walked through the crowd, and they parted without knowing why. And she climbed the steps to the central speaking platform, and she stood there, and the lights caught her skin, and she blazed. No Velnorai had ever stood on a speaking platform there. Had never been a reason to. She looked out at the room full of screaming, frightened, angry beings, and she opened her mouth. The first sound that came out was barely a whisper, and it cracked, and it broke, and it sounded like something being born in pain, but the room heard it, not because it was loud, but because it was impossible. Every voice went silent, and every head turned, and every eye in that hall fixed on the figure standing on the platform, glowing like a captured star. And Princess Seylith Qo'Vaan spoke her first words. Stop. The word was rough and raw and imperfect, and it cost her so much that her whole body shuddered. Please. Her voice broke on the second word, and she gripped the edge of the platform, and her skin flickered, and she pushed through the pain. Listen. 3 words. 3 words learned from a human who sat on the floor of his quarters and taught her the shape of sound, the way you teach someone to walk after a lifetime of being carried. The room did not breathe. She continued, and every word was agony, and every sentence was a war fought inside her own throat. She spoke in galactic common, and she spoke slowly and carefully, and she said that she had spent her whole life hearing every thought around her, and in all those thoughts she had never once heard someone choose to be honest. She said that the Dralith had launched the attack, and she knew this because her people had felt the satisfaction in their soldiers' minds before the network had collapsed into fear. She said this not with anger, but with sorrow. She said that the galaxy was full of species that could project their will across star systems, and could crush planets, and could bend space and time, but not one of them had the courage to stand alone and say what they meant with their own voice. She said she had learned this from a humana species so young the galaxy laughed at them, and so weak. They had no telepathy, and no natural weapons, and no armor, and no venom, and nothing except a stubborn foolish, beautiful insistence on opening their mouths since saying what they felt, even when it was terrifying. She said the bravest thing she had ever seen was a man with no power standing in front of the most dangerous being in her civilization, and refusing to move. She said the galaxy did not need more shared thoughts, it needed more chosen words, and then her body seized. The effort of speaking had torn through her neural pathways like electricity through water, and the psionic network she had been born into was rejecting her like a body rejecting a transplant, and she gasped, and her skin went white, and she collapsed. Elias caught her, had been standing at the edge of the room covered in dust and blood, and he had been watching, and when she fell he moved faster than he had ever moved in his life, and he caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing. Her eyes were open but fading, and her skin was cycling through colors like a dying aurora, and she looked up at him, and her mouth moved and no sound came out, but he read her lips. Worth it. The room was silent, and then something happened that had never happened at a galactic summit in the entire history of the known universe. The Corellan delegates stood and spoke, not to accuse, but to agree. And then a Vithani commander stood and clicked something that the translator rendered as we hear her. And then another and another and another. And across the hall, the Dralith commander sat very still and said nothing because there was nothing to say, because the silent princes had spoken and the galaxy had listened. But Elias was not listening to any of it because the woman in his arms was dying, and her light was going out, and he held her and whispered the only word that mattered: stay. She was dying in the way stars die slowly, and then all at once the Velnorai medical team surrounded her, and their instruments hummed, and their faces were the pale gray of terror, and Valan stood at the edge of the room with his hands pressed against his own skull, because he could feel her fading through the network like a song losing its last notes. Her neural pathways were rewriting themselves, and the ancient telepathic architecture that connected her to her people was collapsing, and new pathways were forming in its place. Pathways built for something the Velnorai had abandoned 10,000 years ago, a voice. But the transition was killing her, because a mind cannot serve two masters, and her brain was tearing itself apart trying to be both what she was born as and what she was becoming. The Velnorai physicians had one solution: realignment. They would reach into her mind and tear out every new pathway and erase every sound she had learned and seal the cracks where her individuality had grown, and she would survive. But she would not be Seylith anymore. She would be perfect and harmonious and empty. Valen gave the order. Dured Elias walked into the room. He was not supposed to be there, and 3 Velnorai guards moved to stop him, and he walked through them the way fire walks through paper, and he did not touch them, and he did not threaten them. He just moved with the kind of certainty that makes even powerful beings step aside. He sat beside her and took her hand. The monitors screamed warnings, and her skin was cycling through colors so fast it looked like static, and her body was shaking. And she was so far away that even the telepaths could barely reach her. But when his hand touched hers, the monitors changed. The feedback loop that was destroying her mind stuttered and slowed, and the chaos in her neural pathways eased just slightly, and the Velnorai physicians stared at their instruments and did not understand what they were seeing. Elias understood. He was Psi-Null, and his mind was a black hole in the telepathic field. And when he touched her, the network could not reach the parts of her that were connected to him, and those parts found silence, and in that silence they found stability. He was not a cure, but he was a wall, and behind that wall her mind could rest. He looked at the physicians and said something that made every Velnorai in the room think he was insane. Stop trying to fix her and start trying to help her change. The Velnorai did not evolve, and the Velnorai did not change, and the Velnorai had been the same for 10,000 years, because sameness was safety and change was death. But Elias was human, and humans had changed more in 10,000 years than most species changed in 1,000,000. Because change was not death to humans, change was Tuesday. He explained it the way he explained everything by talking. plainly and simply, and refusing to be intimidated by the fact that everyone in the room was older and smarter and more powerful than him. Her mind is not breaking down, he said, and it is building something new, and you can either help it build, or you can watch it collapse, but if you tear it down, you will lose her. Either way. Volan looked at him with 300 years of rigid certainty cracking behind his eyes. Koth stood in the doorway and said nothing. The physicians argued in rapid telepathic bursts that Elias could not hear, and then one of them, the youngest one who had been watching the monitors with wide fascinated eyes, said something that silenced the others. The human is right, and the new pathways are not random, and they are structured, and they are building toward a stable configuration, and if we support the transition instead of fighting it, she could survive as both telepathic and vocal, and neither, and both, and something entirely. Navalan looked at Seylith, lying on the table with her light fading, and he remembered the first time he had seen her as an infant, glowing so bright it hurt to look at her, and he remembered swearing to protect her. He gave the order, help her change. The next 6 hours were the longest of Elias Voss's life. The physicians worked, and Koth fed his own psionic energy into Osindun. Seylith destabilized the parts of her mind that were still connected to the network, and Elias held her hand and anchored the parts that were not, and between the three of them, they built a bridge inside her mind. Between the old world and the new, it almost failed twice. The first time her heart stopped, and Elias felt her hand go cold, and he said her name out loud, and the sound traveled through the psi-null void and reached her somewhere in the dark, and she came back. The second time, the network tried to reclaim her, and Koth blocked it, and the effort nearly killed him, and when it was over, his skin had faded from red to the pale pink of exhaustion, and he looked at Elias with eyes that held something new respect. In the 7th hour, the monitors stabilized. Her skin settled into a warm, steady gold, and her heartbeat found its rhythm, and her neural pathways finished their reconstruction. And what they showed was something no Velnorai physician had ever seen: a mind that could reach out through the telepathic network and feel the thoughts of her people, and at the same time form words in a throat that was no longer vestigious. She was not Velnorai. The way they had always been, she was what they could become. Seylith opened her eyes. Elias was there, and his face was haggard, and his eyes were red, and he had not moved in 7 hours, and his hand was still holding hers. She looked at him, and her skin glowed that amber gold he had first seen on the observation deck, and she opened her mouth, and what came out was not rough anymore, and it was not broken. It was soft and clear and warm like sunlight through glass. Thank you for hearing me before I had words. Elias smiled, and it was the kind of smile that comes from a place so deep it has no name, and he did not trust his voice, so he just held her hand and nodded. The summit reconvened 3 days later. The Dralith hegemony found itself isolated because every other species had watched a princess shatter 10,000 years of silence to name their deception, and the weight of that act was heavier than any fleet or weapon. They agreed to negotiations. The treaty was imperfect, because all real things are imperfect, but it was signed, and it held, and it was built on something no galactic treaty had ever been built on before. Not shared power or mutual threat or economic leverage, but the memory of one voice choosing to speak. Seylith was named the first Velnorai ambassador of voice, and she insisted on one condition: a human co-ambassador. The galaxy thought it was a joke. And then they watched Elias Voss and Seylith Qo'Vaan work together, and they stopped laughing because it turned out that a woman who could feel what everyone was thinking and a man who could say what everyone was feeling were an unstoppable combination. On the Velnorai home world, young Velnorai, who had heard the story of the princess, began to whisper to each other, not through the network, but out loud in small secret sounds that had no meaning yet. But that felt like the beginning of something enormous. Koth returned home, and when the High Council asked him to report on the princess, he stood before them and did Something unprecedented. He spoke one word in a voice like grinding stone. Enough. And then he walked out. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed. And it did not change because of a war or treaty or weapon. It changed because of a sound on the last night before they left Ethar Prime. Elias went to the observation deck one final time, and she was there the way she had always been there, standing at the glass with the stars pressing close. But this time, she was not silent. She was telling him about her world and the crystal forests that sang when the wind moved through them, and the 3 moons that rose in sequence like a slow heartbeat, and the way her people dreamed in colors that had no names in any spoken language. She told him all of this out loud, and he listened the way he had always listened, and somewhere in the vast, black distance between the stars, the universe heard something it had never heard before, a Velnorai voice, carried not by telepathy, but by choice and breath and courage, and it echoed. The galaxy had always believed that the most powerful species would be the ones who could project their thoughts the farthest and burn the brightest and conquer the most. They were wrong. The most powerful thing in the universe was a single trembling voice, choosing to speak when silence was easier, and choosing to reach across the void when pulling away was safe. Humanity had not taught the stars how to think. They had taught them something the galaxy had forgotten was possible: how to say what you mean and mean what you say. And say it anyway, even when your voice breaks, even when it hurts, even when the whole universe is listening. And you are afraid, especially then.